WW3 won't start with bombs for you. It will start with empty shelves. Not slowly, not politely. In waves that move faster than logic. Within 72 hours, food doesn't disappear because it's gone. It disappears because everyone suddenly realizes the same thing at the same time. That realization is what empties stores. This is about you, right now. Most people think they'll hear the news and then react. That's fantasy. By the time headlines stabilize, supply chains are already frozen. Trucks stop moving not because roads are destroyed, but because no one knows what tomorrow looks like. And when tomorrow is uncertain, nobody ships food. This is where people get it wrong. They assume scarcity begins when food runs out. It doesn't. It begins when trust collapses. The moment people stop believing restocks are guaranteed, behavior changes instantly. Calm shopping turns into extraction. People don't buy meals. They buy time. The mistake doesn't hurt immediately. It feels like inconvenience at first. Fewer options, longer lines, limits per customer. That's the grace period. That's when you still think rice and pasta will save you because they always have before. Remember this. During the first 72 hours, shelves don't empty evenly. Fresh food goes first. Then staples. Then anything people recognize as survival food. What's left isn't useless, it's misunderstood. And misunderstanding is what separates panic from continuity. And it gets worse. Because the foods people rush toward are the ones with the longest instructions, the most water dependency, the most preparation. They're buying calories that assume electricity, time, and peace. None of those are guaranteed. The foods that don't disappear aren't hidden. They're ignored. They look wrong, cheap, embarrassing, unimpressive. But they were designed for disruption long before war made it fashionable. By the time people realize which foods actually survive disruption, the shelves aren't empty. They've already been sorted. Drop your city in the comments. I want to see where the survivors are watching from. And hit subscribe while you're here. After 72 hours, the shelves aren't just empty. They're reorganized by behavior. This is the phase nobody plans for. Food stops being about nutrition and starts being about certainty. People don't want the best option. They want the option that still works when everything else feels unstable. Familiarity becomes currency. Speed becomes safety. This is the part everyone misses. They assume long shelf life equals long usefulness. It doesn't. Usefulness is conditional on water, on fuel, on quiet, on the ability to prepare food without drawing attention or burning energy you can't replace. The delayed consequence shows up inside homes. Meals become negotiations. Cooking becomes a decision with consequences. Smell leaks, noise travels, time stretches. Suddenly, the food that looked smart becomes expensive in ways labels never mention. And it gets worse, because stress compounds. Hunger isn't just physical, it's psychological. People don't break down because they're starving. They break down because feeding themselves becomes a problem that never fully resolves. This is where certain foods quietly win. Foods that require no explanation, no preparation, no cleanup. Foods that work in the dark, in silence, with cold hands. Foods that don't ask you to believe things will improve tomorrow. The reframe matters here. During WW3, the most valuable foods aren't the ones that last forever. They're the ones that work immediately, without asking for cooperation from systems already failing. Remember this detail. When pressure rises, people don't abandon junk food because it's unhealthy. They abandon good food because it's demanding. What survives on shelves is what survives human behavior under stress. That's why the foods that don't disappear aren't the healthiest or the most expensive. They're the ones nobody argued about. By now, the pattern should be obvious. WW3 doesn't empty shelves randomly. It filters food by friction. This is where most people get caught. They stock for an ideal version of war, where utilities flicker but return, where schedules still exist, where cooking is inconvenient but possible. Real disruption doesn't look like that. It looks like interruption layered on interruption. The mistake doesn't show up on day one. It shows up when fatigue sets in. When every meal requires effort, people start skipping meals. When food requires assembly, people start rationing energy instead of calories. That's when food stops feeding people and starts draining them. Remember this. Foods that survive WW3 don't survive because they're durable. They survive because they collapse steps. Fewer actions between hunger and relief. Fewer opportunities for something to go wrong. And it gets worse. Visibility becomes risk. Cooking smells mark households. Routines attract attention. Repetition creates predictability. Predictability invites questions. The quieter the food, the safer the environment around it. This is the uncomfortable truth. The foods people dismiss as trash were engineered for broken conditions, long before war. Long before collapse. They assume nothing works reliably and design around that. By the time people admit this, they stop asking which foods are healthiest and start asking which foods still function when stress is constant. WW3 doesn't reward discipline. It rewards adaptability. In the next phase, we'll break down exactly which foods don't disappear and why the reasons have nothing to do with expiration dates. Once the shelves are sorted, behavior locks in. This is the phase nobody notices happening because it feels like adaptation, not loss. Food stops being chosen, it starts being defaulted to. Households fall into rhythms based on what still works, not what tastes best, not what's healthiest, what causes the fewest problems, what ends hunger without starting something else. That's when the food that survived the first wave begins shaping the second. This is where most people get caught again. They assume the danger is running out of food. It isn't. It's being trapped with food that requires more from you than you can give. More water, more heat, more patience, more negotiation. Under prolonged stress, those costs compound faster than calories run out. The delayed consequence is internal. People start dreading meals, not because they're hungry, but because feeding themselves has become work that never quite pays off. That's when morale fractures. Arguments start over nothing. Children associate eating with tension. Adults start skipping meals to avoid the process entirely. And it gets worse. Because the foods that stabilize households don't just reduce hunger, they reduce decision-making. They remove choice. And when choice disappears, people relax. Not because things are better, but because they're simpler. Remember this. In prolonged disruption, simplicity is power. The food that keeps working becomes invisible. No debate, no planning. No cleanup ritual. It just happens and life moves on to the next problem. That's why these foods don't disappear. They're not hoarded. They're absorbed. They become background infrastructure inside the home. And once something becomes infrastructure, replacing it feels risky, even if something better appears later. This is the moment when survival quietly stops being about preparation and starts being about inertia. What you're eating now isn't what you chose. It's what the environment selected for you. By this point, WW3 no longer feels hypothetical. Not because of explosions, but because time has changed shape. Days blur. Weeks compress. And food becomes one of the few constants left. The households that endure aren't the ones eating the best. They're the ones thinking about food the least. This is where most people misunderstand resilience. They think it's about stockpiles. It isn't. It's about not having to renegotiate survival every day. The mistake doesn't punish immediately. It punishes when alternatives vanish. When stores don't restock. When aid is inconsistent. When replacement options exist in theory, but not in practice. That's when food choice becomes path-dependent. You're locked into whatever worked last week because experimenting now feels dangerous. And it gets worse. Because once food becomes predictable, people defend it. They rationalize it. They stop questioning downsides because the upside, stability, is too valuable. Nutritional arguments fade. Moral arguments disappear. Only function remains. Remember this detail. Foods that survive long disruptions aren't perfect. They're tolerated. They don't cause problems fast enough to matter. They don't demand changes you can't afford. They don't introduce new variables into an already fragile system. That's why they don't disappear. Not because they're rare, because they're compatible. Compatible with stress, with fatigue, with broken schedules, with environments where nothing else behaves the way it should. By the time the wider population realizes this, the remaining food options aren't being chosen off shelves anymore. They're being passed quietly, shared reluctantly, protected instinctively. Not because people are selfish, because stability is. At the end of this cycle, something uncomfortable becomes clear. Food didn't just keep people alive. It shaped who stayed functional. The households that made it through the longest didn't win because they planned better. They won because their food didn't fight them. It didn't demand belief in recovery. It didn't assume peace, power, or patience would return on schedule. This is the detail people forget. The most dangerous phase of WW3 isn't the beginning, it's the normalization. When disruption stops feeling temporary. When people stop waiting for shelves to refill and start living as if this is the new baseline. That's when food choices stop being strategic and start being structural. And it gets worse, one last time. Because once this structure sets in, changing it feels threatening, even if something healthier appears. Even if something cheaper becomes available, people stick with what didn't fail them when everything else did. Remember this. The foods that don't disappear aren't the ones with the longest shelf life. They're the ones that survived human behavior under pressure. They worked when people were tired, when kids were loud, when tempers were short, when systems were unreliable. They didn't save the future. They stabilized the present. And that's why they mattered. WW3 doesn't reward preparation that looks good. It rewards preparation that goes unnoticed. When everything breaks, the food that still works isn't impressive. It's invisible. And invisibility under pressure is survival.